I've been a soldier all of my life. I've commanded companies. I've commanded regiments. I've commanded divisions. And I have commanded even more. But there are no 15,000 men in the world that can go across that field. General James Longstreet, July 3rd, 1863. Last time we ended with Meade's decision to remain at Gettysburg. Now, at this point, the Army of Northern Virginia had been bloodied, most poorly. The Army of the Potomac had held, but the battle is still not over. Now, we will start with the third and final day of the battle. But Lee had made another plan early the morning of July 3rd. Following the failure of the final assault on Culp's Hill, the plan was as follows. He would give James Longstreet, his most trusted commander, 3 divisions, and cross the open field between the Confederate and Union lines to a copse of trees. Copse is probably how it's actually pronounced. Copse of trees that sat between the Emmitsburg and Taneytown Road. Longstreet, in fact, did not believe it was a good idea, specifically because the open land between the positions, the Union interior lines, and most importantly, the commander of the Union center was Winfield Scott Hancock. We will have another video talking about Hancock, but at this point, all we need to know is Hancock was not only one of the most competent generals of the Union Army, and not only that, but December 1862, he was in Longstreet's position arguing with Ambrose Burnside about not attacking Maury's Heights at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Longstreet could recognize this plan was exactly the same assault as Fredericksburg, but now in reverse. Another issue was that Longstreet only had one fresh division. That was his Virginians under George Pickett. McLaws and Hood's divisions had been very badly damaged on July 2nd, but Lee had known this and already planned for it. He would take Johnson Pettigrew from A.P. Hill's corps and place General Isaac Trumbull in command of William Pender's division, who was killed on the first day. So now Longstreet was given Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trumbull's divisions. The plan was as follows. The Confederates will march in a long front across the Union line and converge on the copse of trees and break through the center. Lee's sincere belief was the Union had exhausted their reserves on Culp's Hill and the Round Tops. So if they moved quick and hard enough, they could split the line and maybe not destroy, but rout the Federal Army. This was a Hail Mary if there ever was one. He then also planned a large cavalry action at the rear of the Union position to strike the Union supply lines at the Baltimore Pike. Again, this is a Hail Mary, if there truly ever was one. But Lee knew what his army was capable of and had beaten the odds before. So early in the morning, beneath the cover of trees, the 3 divisions began to deploy. Across the field at Cemetery Ridge, the 2nd Corps was resting, many soldiers and officers not expecting an assault at the center. The Union knew it would be a suicide attack between artillery at Culp's and the Round Tops. The field between the Confederates and Cemetery Ridge would be a hornet's nest of artillery, ripping into any attackers. Then not only the veteran 2nd Corps holding the position, but Meade had placed the fresh 6th Corps directly behind Cemetery Ridge. But again, Lee did not have any of this information before devising the plan. Hancock also would not allow his men to rout, especially after his defeat at Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg. He had also been jubilant after the success of his corps holding the Confederates back for the army to reform. Sitting at the center of his position was the 69th Pennsylvania Irish, 59th New York, and 7th Michigan. The field was silent until 1 o'clock p.m. The largest artillery bombardment on the Western Hemisphere began. Longstreet's artillery chief, Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, with 150 to 180 cannons, opened up on the Union line, hoping they would break up the defenders. But instead, the Second Corps put their gear on and started forming up on the stone wall that would later become known as the Angle. Longstreet watched speechless with Pickett. Then Union artillery returned fire. Some say the loud artillery duel could be heard as far as Philadelphia and Harrisburg. Lee watched, himself a student of Napoleon, impressed by the awesome pounding that began. One of the first casualties is General Meade himself. He was not killed, but one of the first shells to strike hit his headquarters, causing a large piece of the house to be blown up and knock him incapacitated. Hancock was now in total command of the field. As he rode up and down his line, his Second Corps, who had suffered brutally at Fredericksburg and resisted hardest at Chancellorsville, now was the time for vengeance. Longstreet sat for a time with Pickett, watching the bombardment, until a rider approached the two generals. Pickett took the dispatch and read it. "For God's sakes, come on quick, or we cannot support you. Ammunition's nearly out." The dispatch was from Colonel Alexander. Pickett then requested his orders. Longstreet in his heart could not even say the words. Pickett snapped to attention. "Sir, shall I commence the attack?" Still unable to speak, as if a higher power had taken his voice, Longstreet simply nodded. Pickett saluted, writing to his men. At 2:00 p.m., 12,500 men advanced out of the woods across from Cemetery Ridge. The drums beat in sync so loud you could hear it across the field. Pickett's division was set up with the brigades of Richard Garnett and James Kemper at the front, and reserve was Louis Armistead, who, in a sad irony, was a dear friend of Winfield Scott Hancock. North of them was Pettigrew and Tremble's divisions. They began their march across the field. Confederate troops were hoping, because of the Federal artillery had stopped, but this wasn't what the Southerners had hoped. Upon the Southern halt of artillery, the Union paused, not to withdraw, but to reform and bring up ammunition for their guns. The Confederate infantry was hopeful that the Federals had retreated, but up and down the line, Union troops had taken cover behind the stone wall. The irony of the bombardment was that the Confederates were actually overshooting the position. Most of their shells were hitting near the Taneytown Road. That's why General Meade's headquarters were striked. However, the Union, as the Confederates advanced, began to open fire on the three divisions, tearing large gaps into the lines with their canister shots exploding above the rebels and even in the lines themselves. Southern troops then, after the march, still optimistic, began to jump and take down the fence at the Emmitsburg Road. It was at this point, on horseback, Hancock ordered his corps to rise up. To the Southerners' surprise, a large wave of blue rose up from behind the stone wall, firing into them as they attempt to reform on the streets. General Kemper and Garnett attempted to rally their men as they advanced towards the Union line, but the Virginians began to break as Hancock directed the Vermont brigades at the south to flank the Southerners, and in the north the 8th Ohio and 136th New York and 1st Massachusetts flanking in the north, putting the Southerners into a hail gunfire from three directions. However, it's at this time a bullet will hit General Hancock's saddle. The bullet would explode the pommel of his saddle, causing wood and a large nail to pierce his inner thigh, wounding him. Pretty severely, in fact. Unlike his colleague officers, Hancock was heard saying, "I will not be moved until this engagement is decided." So instead of being removed from the field, he stayed until the Southern attack was repulsed. Then General Caldwell of the 1st Division would take command, but later General William Hayes would take command of the corps. Also at this point, General Garnett was killed. He was never actually identified among the dead at Pickett's charge, but it's assumed he was just that badly damaged. James Kemper was wounded. Trimble was also wounded, and Pettigrew's division was being slaughtered. The Virginians were breaking, but finally General Armistead and his brigade finally came forward. Noticing the divisions were floundering, he removed his hat, placing it on top of the tip of his sword, and rallied the Virginians, leading the assault as the Union infantry laid more fire into the Southern infantry. Now we can discuss the bravery of Lieutenant Alonzo Cushing, who, even as his artillery crew was breaking, he continued to fire even on his own. Firing grape shot into the advancing Confederates, he was quoted as saying, "I will give them one more shot." As the crews withdrew, Cushing's bravery was rewarded by immediately being shot in the mouth. The 69th Pennsylvania and the other Union regiments began to fall back as the Virginians jumped the angle. Armstead was again hopeful that Lee was right, but as they came over the stone wall, he could see the Union reserves. The Second Corps men reformed as the Union reserves fired into the advancing Virginians. Across the field, Lee could see the battle flags going over the stone wall, a moment he thought his plan would succeed. After a volley, the reformed Second Corps and reserves charged into the Confederate troops. It is at this point that Louis Armstead is shot, collapsing as the Union strikes the Virginians back. Pickett at one moment thought he was going to be the man to win the war, end it all, but now he was watching his men retreat. So scared, they retreated facing the Union lines, just so they would not get shot in the back. The entire Second Corps started chanting at the retreating Southerners, "Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg," mocking Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia for making the same mistake the Army of the Potomac had made at Fredericksburg. Upon arriving at the scene of his retreating Virginians, Lee began to blame himself, admitting to his hubris that he had thought they were invincible. The soldiers tried to support their commander, dismissing the claims and crying their love for him, but now the plan was to prepare for a counterattack that may come. Soon Lee had come up to General Pickett, directing the general to reform and prepare for a Union counterattack. Pickett, with a haunted and destroyed look, said nothing to Lee. Lee repeated, "General Pickett, you must look to your division." Pickett, again with a haunting look, looked at Lee and responded, "General Lee, I have no division." Of Pickett's division alone, they had lost all 3 brigade commanders. Garnett dead, Armstead wounded and captured, and Jimmy Kemper was wounded, believed he was going to die, but would later survive. Armstead would actually be tended to by Captain Henry H. Bingham, who would be immortalized in the monument Friend to Friend, which is still at Gettysburg National Cemetery to this day. East of Gettysburg, a cavalry attack was set to break the Union position from the rear, but they would be intercepted by General Gregg's Union cavalry, and a brave young cavalry officer would lead a charge breaking Stuart's assault. This man would be George A. Custer. As night fell, the fighting was finally over. Lee had pulled all 3 corps back, fearing a counterattack due to he being spread too thin. On July 4th, but the attack never came. After realizing this, the Army of Northern Virginia will begin its long retreat back to Virginia. The battle had taken the lives of 7,863 men, about 27,224 wounded, many of those would die, and 11,199 missing or captured. It had been the 3 most brutal days in the history of the continental North America. Stories of Lee's ambulance train added more heartbreak, as many soldiers would demand to be left on the side of roads instead of having to ride the bumpy ambulance wagons. George Meade would in fact remain commander of the Army of the Potomac until the end of the war, but he would be criticized by President Lincoln for not pursuing the Confederates more aggressively after the battle. Most historians at this point have agreed Meade did what in the situation was the best thing for his army that had been on a forced march for weeks and then fought the most brutal battle in the most hottest 3 days up to really any time in our country's history, and then he was given the chore of cleaning the field. General Hancock would survive his wounds, serving till the end of the war, being the man who actually commanded the execution of the Lincoln assassination conspirators, and even running for president against James Garfield. Clearly we know how that went, since we don't have a President Hancock. Dan Sickles, after the war, would go back into politics. Longstreet, though opposed to Gettysburg from the onset, would continue to fight in the Army of Northern Virginia, and at the end of the war actually be the most criticized general, because he point blank blamed Robert E. Lee for the failure. He would be one of the first Confederate generals repatriatized by Ulysses S. Grant when he's president, because he was dear friends with Longstreet. Robert E. Lee, to this day, is one of the most beloved generals in American history. He would serve to the end of the war, surrendering to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, in 1865. He would then speak in support of the freed slaves and reunification, and would be repatriatized as well, becoming the president of Washington University, which after his death would be renamed Washington and Lee University, where he is entombed to this day. This is a series I didn't know how to go about originally, because it is a very important subject to me and my family, and many others. As I mentioned, we are reenactors and historians, and Gettysburg has always had a special place on our hearts. So thank you so much for watching this. This is not our last episode in our Gettysburg series. I will be covering and discussing specific units, individuals, and even command structures of both armies in more detail. But instead of my usual sign-off, I wanted to read something Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain wrote at the anniversary of the battle. So please like, share, and subscribe, and thank you for watching, and here we go. In great deeds, something abides. On great fields, something stays. Forms change and pass. Bodies disappear, but spirits linger to consecrate ground for the vision place of souls. Generations that know us not, and that know not of. Heart drawn to see where and by whom great things were suffered and done for them, shall come to this deathless field to ponder and dream. And lo, the mighty shadow of a mighty presence shall wrap them in its bosom, and the power of the vision pass into their souls. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain.